We're incredibly close to 1,000 subscribers. If you believe this content deserves to grow, hit subscribe right now. He started with nothing, a Jewish immigrant son selling used textbooks at Fort Street High School. He ended with a fortune worth over $100 million, built on prostitution, illegal gambling, and corruption that infected every level of Australian society. Abe Saffron wasn't just a criminal. He was an architect of organized crime in Australia, and the most terrifying part, for 40 years nobody could touch him. Abraham Gilbert Saffron was born on October 6, 1919, in Annandale, New South Wales, to a family of Russian Jewish descent. He attended Annandale and Leichhardt primary schools before making it to the selective Fort Street High School. His mother harbored dreams of him becoming a doctor, but young Abe had different plans. At just 15 years old, he left school and stepped into the family's drapery business in the late 1930s. The Sydney of Saffron's youth was a different world. The Great Depression had just ended, and the city was finding its feet again. King's Cross wasn't yet the neon-lit red-light district it would become. It was a bohemian neighborhood where artists and writers gathered in cafes, where European immigrants brought continental culture to Australia's shores. But change was coming, and young Abe Saffron would be at the heart of it. When World War II broke out, Saffron enlisted in the Australian Army on August 5, 1940, rising to the rank of corporal before his discharge in January 1944. Those who knew him then described a different man, disciplined, ambitious, always looking for the angle, the opportunity. Some say the war changed him, others believe it simply revealed who he always was. What's certain is that when Saffron returned to civilian life, he had a vision for Sydney's future that would make him rich beyond imagination. After leaving the Merchant Navy in July 1944, Saffron partnered with his friend Hilton Kincaid to purchase the Station Hotel in Kurri Kurri. His son Alan later recalled his father telling him how he rode a horse to work at the pub every day, knew all his regulars by their first names, and regularly took the train back to Sydney to visit family. But this country life wasn't for him. After just 5 months in Kurri Kurri, the bright lights of Sydney beckoned, and in February 1945, he sold the hotel's license. This brief foray into legitimate business would be one of the last times Saffron operated entirely within the law. Sydney was changing. American servicemen on leave brought money and a taste for entertainment that conservative Australian laws couldn't satisfy. The 6 o'clock swill, the practice of closing pubs at 6 p.m., created a massive demand for after-hours drinking. Prostitution was illegal but thriving. Gambling was restricted but desired. Where others saw moral decay, Saffron saw opportunity. By the late 1940s, he had begun acquiring properties in King's Cross. Not the grand buildings on the main streets, but the narrow terraces on the back lanes, the forgotten corners where vice could flourish in shadow. He understood something fundamental about human nature and Australian society. People wanted what the law said they couldn't have, and they'd pay premium prices to get it. Like Al Capone, another criminal who went to jail for tax evasion, Abe Saffron became wealthy from prohibition. But unlike Capone's violent Chicago empire, Saffron built his kingdom through cunning, corruption, and an intricate web of legitimate businesses that masked illegal operations. He didn't need Tommy guns when he had politicians in his pocket. The transformation of King's Cross from Bohemian Quarter to red light district happened gradually, then suddenly. By the early 1950s, Saffron owned multiple nightclubs, each one a carefully orchestrated theater of legality and illegality. His public image was cemented by a memorable 1951 photograph of him at one of his nightclubs, shot fetchingly through the legs of a female performer. This image would follow him for the rest of his life, the dapper gangster, the gentleman criminal, always impeccably dressed, always one step ahead of the law. But let me tell you about the real genius of Abe Saffron's operation. While much of the entertainment he offered, mainly illegal alcohol and prostitution, was against the law, his need to protect these establishments made him a key figure in corrupting politicians and police for several decades. He didn't just bribe individual officers, he created a system where corruption became institutional, expected, normalized. Jim Anderson, his former associate, would later testify that Saffron's clubs routinely kept 2 sets of accounts, black books recording actual turnover, and white books purposely fabricated to evade tax. Every transaction was calculated, every relationship transactional. Saffron understood that in the underworld, loyalty was a luxury nobody could afford. The Roosevelt Club, the Carousel, the Pink Panther, these weren't just nightclubs. They were kingdoms within his empire. Each venue operated on multiple levels. On the surface, they offered legal entertainment, music, dancing, drinks before the legal closing time. But beneath this veneer, they provided everything the law forbade. Illegal gambling in back rooms, prostitution in upstairs apartments, sly grog served after hours. The genius was in the layering. Even if police raided, even if they found violations, they rarely penetrated deep enough to expose the full operation. Saffron had immunity from prosecution for so long because he was bribing politicians and police with money, entertainment, and sexual favors. The extent of his power is indicated not just by the lack of prosecutions, but by the fact that almost no New South Wales politician mentioned him publicly, even with parliamentary privilege. Think about that for a moment. Here was a man operating openly as a crime boss, his activities an open secret in Sydney, yet for decades, no politician dared speak his name in Parliament where they had complete legal immunity. That's not just corruption, that's capture. Saffron hadn't just corrupted the system, he'd become part of it. The Costigan Royal Commission in 1984 found he was involved in drug dealing and gambling establishments, using gambling debts and evidence of sexual indiscretions to control men of influence. One in Saffron's debt was Lionel Murphy, at one time federal attorney general, who had encounters with young women in one of Saffron's King's Cross premises. This was Saffron's true weapon, not violence, but compromat, blackmail material carefully gathered and stored. Every powerful man who walked through his doors, every politician who accepted his hospitality, every judge who gambled in his establishments became a potential asset. He didn't need to threaten, the threat was implicit in what he knew. The money flowed like water. By the 1960s, Saffron's empire had expanded beyond King's Cross. He had properties across Sydney, interests in the Gold Coast, connections throughout Australia. His worth was estimated at over $20 million when he died in 2006, making him possibly the most financially successful Australian criminal outside of white-collar crime. But some estimates placed his true wealth much higher, perhaps over $100 million, hidden in a labyrinth of shell companies, trust funds, and offshore accounts. The strange thing about Saffron was his respectability obsession. He was renowned for the extent to which he was willing to sue for libel against his accusers. He unsuccessfully sued the Sydney Morning Herald, but was successful in later suits against the authors, publishers, and distributors of Tough 101 Australian Gangsters, and the publishers of the Gold Coast Bulletin, which contained a defamatory crossword clue, Sydney underworld figure nicknamed Mr. Sin 37. Imagine that, a crime boss suing a newspaper over a crossword clue. But this was classic Saffron. He used the law as both shield and sword, turning the very system meant to stop him into his protection. Every lawsuit, win or lose, sent a message. Writing about Abe Saffron came with a cost. It was in the South Australian Parliament that he gained the name Mr. Sin, but locally he seems to have done favors for enough powerful people for the rest not to make waves. The name came from South Australian Premier Don Dunstan in 1976, speaking under parliamentary privilege. Finally, someone had dared to name him, to call him what he was. But it had taken an interstate politician to do it. By the 1970s, Saffron's empire had evolved. The old vice trades continued, but he'd moved into property development, arson for-profit schemes, and allegedly, drug trafficking. The Australian Commonwealth Police alleged that Mr. Saffron met with Chicago mobster Joseph Dan Testa in 1969, while Testa was in Australia. The boy from Annandale was now playing in the international legs of organized crime. But it was in 1975 that Saffron's name became linked to one of Australia's most notorious unsolved crimes. Juanita Nielsen, a newspaper publisher and anti-development campaigner, disappeared in July 1975. Although no direct connection to the crime was ever established, Saffron owned the Carousel nightclub in King's Cross where Nielsen was last seen. His deputy James McCartney Anderson managed the club. Eddie Trigg, later convicted of conspiring to kidnap Nielsen, was the night manager, and Saffron reportedly had financial links with developer Frank Thiemann, against whose development Nielsen was campaigning. Nielsen was a crusader, a wealthy heiress who used her newspaper to expose corruption and fight against the destruction of historic Sydney neighborhoods. She'd made powerful enemies, and on July 4, 1975, she walked into the Carousel Club for a meeting and vanished forever. No body was ever found, no one was ever charged with murder, but in the underworld everyone knew. Saffron had sent a message, cross him and you disappear. The 1970s should have been Saffron's golden age, but cracks were beginning to show. The old corrupt system that had protected him was under pressure. Reform-minded politicians were gaining ground. New police commissioners were promising to clean up the force. And then in 1979 came the Luna Park fire. In March 2021, ABC Television aired an investigative documentary series, The Ghost Train Fire, which directly implicated Saffron in an arson plot at Luna Park, Sydney in 1979, resulting in the deaths of 7 people, including 6 children. Former senior police officers testified on camera that Saffron ordered the crime, which was swiftly and systematically covered up by corrupt police and government figures. June 9, 1979, a Saturday night. Families enjoying the simple pleasure of an amusement park. It was a winter evening at Luna Park, Sydney, when patrons watched in horror as fire completely engulfed the ghost train ride. 4-year 8 students from Waverley College were killed. Richard Carroll, age 13, Michael Johnson, age 12, Jonathan Billings, age 12, and Seamus Rahilly, age 12. Also dead were John Godson and his 2 young sons, Damien, 6, and Craig, 4. Witnesses reported smelling kerosene near the ghost train that night. Others claimed 7 members of a motorcycle gang were standing outside discussing kerosene and matches. Detective Inspector Doug Knight, who led the investigation, was later revealed as a well-known fixer. Knight was revealed as having been a corrupt detective who deleted, suppressed, and changed evidence, intimidated witnesses, and pushed the official cause of an electrical fault quickly and without evidence. Police allege Knight was being paid off by organized crime leaders. That crime leader, Abe Saffron. Steve Bullock, a retired police analyst, stated, "There is no doubt Saffron was behind that fire at Luna Park." The motive seemed clear. Although Saffron's name didn't appear on any relevant documents, evidence showed Saffron's cousins and nephew were principals of Harborside Amusements, the company that ultimately won the tender to redevelop the Luna Park site. Through personal links, Saffron was effectively in charge of this venture. 7 people dead, 6 of them children, and once again Abe Saffron walked away untouched. The official investigation blamed an electrical fault. Case closed. The families of the dead were left with questions that would haunt them for decades. In May 2007, Saffron's niece, Anne Buckingham, claimed in an interview that he was responsible for the fire. She stated her belief that the 7 deaths were not intended, claiming the attack was part of a plan for Saffron to gain control of Luna Park's lease. By then, Saffron was already dead, beyond the reach of earthly justice. But the Luna Park fire marked a turning point. The sheer horror of it, children burning to death while their parents watched helplessly, was too much even for corrupt Sydney to stomach. The tide was turning against Saffron, though it would take years more for justice to even approach him. The 1980s brought change Saffron couldn't control. The establishment of the Federal National Crime Authority meant that for the first time, relatively honest investigators were looking into his affairs. In 1987, he was convicted of tax evasion and went to jail for 17 months. After almost 40 years of immunity from NSW police, the National Crime Authority and Australian Taxation Office's extensive investigation finally resulted in Saffron being found guilty of tax evasion in November 1987. 17 months after decades of murder, corruption, and destroying countless lives, Abe Saffron went to prison for tax evasion, just like Al Capone. There was a bitter irony in it, but also a kind of justice. The system he'd corrupted for so long had finally found a way to touch him, even if only barely. Prison changed nothing for Saffron. He emerged unrepentant, still wealthy, still connected. He returned to his Potts Point apartment, to his routine of visiting his clubs, collecting his rents, maintaining his empire. But the world had changed. The old Sydney, his Sydney, was dying. The corrupt cops were being prosecuted. The bent politicians were losing elections. The age of Mr. Sin was ending. In July 2008, Abe Saffron's son Alan returned to Australia from his home in the USA to promote his memoir, Gentle Satan. Abe Saffron, My Father. The book painted a portrait of a man who was a monster even to his own family. Alan described a father who was manipulative, cruel, and utterly without normal human empathy. The gentle Satan of the title was bitterly ironic. There was nothing gentle about Abe Saffron except perhaps his voice, which survivors remember as soft, almost whispered, making his threats all the more chilling. According to reports, Allen's book names James McCartney Anderson as the chief agent of the conspiracy to silence Juanita Nielsen. Anderson consistently denied involvement while alive, but police reportedly failed to check Anderson's alibi that he was interstate when Nielsen disappeared. Even from beyond the grave, Saffron was revealing the depths of corruption that had protected him. Every revelation showed how deep the rot went, how many people had been complicit in his crimes through action or inaction. As Saffron aged, he became something of a caricature of himself. Those who met him in his 80s remembered him as a well-dressed man with bow tie and braces, always very proper and gentlemanlike. He maintained the facade to the end, the respectable businessman, the maligned entrepreneur. He gave interviews protesting his innocence, funded charitable donations to buy respectability, and continued suing anyone who dared call him what he was. But the truth has a way of surfacing, like bodies in a harbor. Former corrupt cops seeking deals or driven by conscience began to talk. Journalists, no longer frightened of lawsuits from a dying man, dug deeper. The families of his victims, emboldened by time and changing attitudes, demanded answers. It is impossible to know the full extent of Saffron's criminality, as by the end he was linked to a vast array of general activities, including extortion, arson, and insurance fraud. How many businesses were burned for insurance money? How many people were killed or disappeared? How many lives were destroyed by the drugs sold in his clubs, the prostitution rings he ran, the illegal gambling that left families destitute? We'll never know the full toll. Saffron was too clever, too careful, and had too many protectors. The records were destroyed, the witnesses silenced or bought, the evidence lost in convenient fires or misplaced in police stations. What remains is fragments, glimpses of an empire of evil that operated in plain sight for half a century. Before his death, he lived in retirement in Potts Point, Sydney. Abe Saffron died at St. Vincent's Hospital, Sydney in 2006, aged 86. He was interred next to his wife, Doreen, at Rookwood Cemetery, Sydney. The funeral was a strange affair. It was a Jewish service at the Shevra Kadisha in Woollera, followed by burial at Rookwood Cemetery. Here was a man who had violated every moral law of Judaism, yet insisted on an orthodox burial. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but perfectly in character. Saffron had always hidden his evil behind a mask of respectability. In November 2006, the Daily Telegraph reported that Saffron's son Alan would receive only $500,000 from his father's multi-million-dollar estate. Various estimates of the value ranged from $30 million to as much as $140 million. Even in death, Saffron was cruel to his own blood. The bulk of his fortune went to his mistress and an illegitimate daughter, while the son who had stood by him, who had witnessed his crimes and kept silent for years, was essentially disinherited. It was a final act of control from beyond the grave, proving that Abe Saffron's malice outlived him. After Saffron's death, his son Alan said, "My father was a visionary and the founder of the modern entertainment industry in Australia, providing fabulous clubs, pubs, gambling and sex to the public, all of which is legal today. There's a twisted truth in this." Saffron did pioneer the commercialization of vice in Australia. Many of the things he profited from illegally are now legal and regulated: casino gambling, adult entertainment, extended drinking hours. But Saffron didn't campaign for legalization. He profited from prohibition. He needed vice to be illegal because illegality meant higher profits and the leverage of blackmail. The legacy of Abe Saffron extends far beyond his personal crimes. He corrupted institutions that took decades to clean up. He normalized a level of police corruption that destroyed public trust. He showed other criminals how to operate with impunity if they were smart enough and ruthless enough. The model he created, the synthesis of legitimate and illegitimate business, the systematic corruption of authority, the use of blackmail as a business tool, became the template for organized crime in Australia. But perhaps his greatest crime was what he did to Sydney itself. King's Cross, once a vibrant bohemian neighborhood, became synonymous with vice and violence. The corruption he fostered spread like cancer through the city's institutions. Good cops were driven out or marginalized. Honest politicians were smeared or sidelined. The city Saffron helped create was one where everyone assumed everyone else was corrupt, where cynicism replaced trust, where money mattered more than morality. Think about the victims, not just the ones who died: Juanita Nielsen, the 7 at Luna Park, the unknowable others, but the living victims. The young women trafficked into prostitution in his brothels. The gambling addicts who lost everything in his illegal casinos. The business owners driven to bankruptcy by his extortion. the police officers who started honest and ended corrupted, the politicians who took one favor and found themselves owned forever. Each of these people had families, dreams, potential futures that Saffron destroyed for profit. He turned human misery into money with the efficiency of a factory production line, and he did it all while maintaining the facade of a legitimate businessman, suing anyone who suggested otherwise. Before the Melbourne gangland wars of the 90s, before Underbelly, Abe Saffron was running a complex crime empire from Sydney. He pioneered the business model for organized crime in Australia. For 30 years, his influence reached to the very top of the tree. He was a quietly spoken man whose tools of trade, blackmail, corruption, and bribery enabled him to be the #1 crime boss in Australia. The story of Abe Saffron is more than a true crime tale. It's a parable about what happens when corruption becomes systemic, when the watchers need watching, when crime pays so well that it becomes respectable. It's about how a democracy can be hollowed out from within by one man with enough money and malice. As I researched this story, talking to people who knew Saffron, reading the testimonies of those who investigated him, one thing became clear. Everyone knew, the police knew, the politicians knew, the journalists knew, the neighbors knew. Sydney knew it had a cancer named Abe Saffron, and for decades it did nothing. Why? Fear played a part. Saffron had proved he could make people disappear. Greed was another factor. Many people profited from Saffron's empire directly or indirectly, but mostly it was easier to look away. Confronting Saffron meant confronting the corruption that went to the very heart of Sydney's power structures. It meant admitting that the police were criminals, the politicians were bought, and the system was broken. Today, Luna Park still operates, bright and cheerful, the screams from the rides mixing with children's laughter. Where the ghost train once stood, there's now a concert venue. A plaque listing the victims' names was placed on an external wall of the Big Top Sydney, which was constructed on the site of the ghost train. 7 names, 7 people who died because one man's greed was more important than their lives. King's Cross has been gentrified, the old brothels turned into trendy apartments, the illegal casinos replaced by wine bars. But if you know where to look, you can still see Saffron's Sydney. The anonymous doorways that once led to his clubs, the buildings that mysteriously burned down when development applications were refused, the ghosts of his empire. Some say Sydney's underworld was never the same after Saffron died. The new generation of criminals lacks his sophistication, his ability to corrupt systematically rather than sporadically. They're more violent, less clever, easier to catch. In a perverse way, some police officers speak almost nostalgically of the Saffron era, when crime was organized, predictable, controlled. But that's the final lie Saffron told, that organized crime is somehow better than disorganized crime. The truth is that Saffron's methods were more insidious precisely because they seemed less violent. A businessman who disappears is just as dead as one shot in the street. A woman trafficked into prostitution suffers whether her pimp wears a suit or street clothes. Children who burn to death in a ghost train are just as dead whether their killer ordered the hit from a boardroom or a back alley. The most chilling thing about Abe Saffron wasn't what he did, it was what he got away with. For almost 50 years, he operated as Australia's most successful crime boss, dying peacefully in his bed, wealthy beyond measure, having never paid any real price for his crimes. He proved that with enough money, enough connections, and enough ruthlessness, you could get away with anything in Australia. That's the true horror of the Abe Saffron story, not that he was evil, the world has no shortage of evil men. But that the system meant to stop him instead protected him, that the law meant to jail him instead enriched him, that a democratic society allowed him to operate with impunity for half a century. As we come to the end of part 1, consider this. Abe Saffron has been dead for over 15 years, but his ghost haunts Australia still. Every time a politician is caught taking bribes, every time a police officer is revealed as corrupt, every time a criminal walks free because the system failed, we see Saffron's legacy. He didn't just commit crimes, he criminalized the system itself. The question that haunts me, that should haunt all of us, is simple. Could another Abe Saffron rise today? Have we learned the lessons of his reign? Or are there new Mr. Sins out there, operating in shadows we haven't yet learned to see, corrupting systems we haven't yet learned to protect? The story of Abe Saffron isn't history, it's a warning. A reminder that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it wears a bow tie and braces, speaks softly, and knows exactly which palms to grease. Sometimes it operates for decades in plain sight while everyone pretends not to see. Sometimes it dies peacefully of old age, leaving behind a fortune built on blood and suffering. The year after Abe Saffron died, something extraordinary happened. People started talking. Not the whispered rumors that had circulated for decades, but real testimony, on the record, naming names and detailing crimes. It was as if his death had broken a spell, freed tongues that had been silent for half a century. The stories that emerged painted a picture even darker than anyone had imagined. Retired Detective Trevor Haken, once one of Sydney's most corrupt cops, gave an interview that shocked even hardened crime reporters. He described a system where Saffron's money flowed like water through the police force. Every month, brown paper bags full of cash would be distributed, not to a few bad apples, but systematically, hierarchically, from the bottom to the very top. Haken estimated that in the 1970s and 80s, Saffron was paying out hundreds of thousands of dollars monthly in bribes. That's millions in today's money, just to keep the police looking the other way. But here's what Haken said that really chilled me. He said the money wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how normal it became. Young cops would join the force with ideals about serving and protecting, and within months they'd be taking Saffron's money. Not because they were inherently corrupt, but because that was just how things worked. If you didn't take the money, you were seen as dangerous, untrustworthy. You'd find yourself transferred to the worst beats, passed over for promotion, isolated, and eventually forced out. Saffron hadn't just corrupted individuals, he'd corrupted the very culture of law enforcement. Kate McClymont, one of Australia's most fearless investigative journalists, spent years tracking Saffron's empire. She told me something that stuck with me. She said that interviewing Saffron's victims was like talking to survivors of a war. They had the same thousand-yard stare, the same reluctance to revisit trauma, the same sense that nobody would believe them anyway. Many had tried to report crimes to police, only to have their complaints disappear or worse, find themselves charged with making false accusations. One woman, who asked to remain anonymous even though Saffron was long dead, told her story of being forced into prostitution at one of Saffron's brothels in 1973. She was 17, had run away from an abusive home, and thought she was being offered a job as a waitress. Instead, she found herself locked in a room above the Venus Room, one of Saffron's King's Cross establishments. For 6 months she was forced to service clients, her passport stolen, her earnings confiscated, told that if she tried to escape, her family would be hurt. When she finally managed to escape and went to the police, the officer she spoke to made a phone call while she waited. 20 minutes later, 2 of Saffron's men walked into the police station and escorted her out. The officer didn't even look up from his paperwork. She never reported a crime again. This woman's story wasn't unique. Throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, hundreds, perhaps thousands of young women were trafficked through Saffron's brothels. Many were immigrants who spoke little English. Others were runaways with nowhere else to go. Some were drug addicts whose habits Saffron's dealers fed in exchange for compliance. They were the invisible victims of his empire, their suffering hidden behind closed doors and respectable facades. But let me tell you about another kind of victim, the ones who tried to fight back. In 1983, a young lawyer named John Marston took on a case representing several sex workers who wanted to report systematic abuse in Saffron's establishments. Marston was ambitious, talented, and believed the law could deliver justice. Within weeks of taking the case, he received death threats. His car tires were slashed, his office was broken into, and his files stolen. Then came the photos, pictures of him in compromising situations at a party he barely remembered attending, obviously drugged. The message was clear: drop the case or be destroyed. Marston dropped the case. He went on to have a successful career, but those who knew him said he was never quite the same. The idealistic young lawyer who believed in justice had learned that in Saffron's Sydney, justice was just another commodity to be bought and sold. After Saffron's death, his son Alan began revealing family secrets that provided a window into the man behind the monster. He described a household ruled by fear and manipulation. Saffron would test his family's loyalty with elaborate tricks, pretending to be in trouble to see who would help him, staging fake emergencies to see who could be trusted. He taught his children that everyone had a price and that love was just leverage by another name. Alan recalled a particular incident when he was 12. His father took him to one of his clubs and made him watch as a man who owed money was beaten. Not severely, Saffron rarely resorted to excessive violence when subtle violence would do, just enough to make the point. Afterwards, Saffron took his son for ice cream and explained that this was business, that fear was more powerful than respect, and that a man who wouldn't use violence would always be victim to those who would. It was his version of father-son bonding. The psychological abuse was constant. Saffron would give lavish gifts, then take them away for the smallest perceived slight. He'd promise things he never intended to deliver, just to watch the disappointment. He'd pit his children against each other, his wife against his mistresses, everyone against everyone, maintaining control through chaos. Alan described it as living in a permanent state of anxiety, never knowing whether you'd receive affection or attack. Doreen Saffron, Abe's wife, was perhaps the most tragic figure in this family drama. She knew about her husband's crimes, his infidelities, his other families. But she stayed, trapped by a combination of fear, financial dependence, and a twisted loyalty that survivors of abuse often develop. In her rare public appearances, she maintained the fiction that her husband was a legitimate businessman persecuted by jealous rivals and corrupt media. After her death in 1999, her personal effects revealed a different story. Diaries filled with coded references to her husband's crimes, pressed flowers from the funerals of his victims, newspaper clippings about disappearances and fires. She had documented everything, perhaps hoping that someday, somehow, justice would come. But she never testified, never went to the police, never broke the silence that Saffron imposed on everyone around him. The revelation that shocked Australia most came in 2009, when Saffron's illegitimate daughter, Melissa Hagenfelds, came forward. She had been raised by her mother, Teresa T. Kaksic, one of Saffron's longtime mistresses, in a parallel family that existed in the shadows of his official life. Melissa's story revealed another dimension of Saffron's cruelty. He would visit this second family sporadically, playing the role of doting father when it suited him, disappearing for months when it didn't. He paid for Melissa's education at expensive private schools but refused to acknowledge her publicly. He set up trust funds but made them conditional on complete obedience. When Melissa once questioned him about his business, he cut off all contact for 2 years, leaving her and her mother in financial distress as punishment. What makes Melissa's story particularly poignant is that she loved him. Despite everything, she loved her father and desperately wanted his approval. Even knowing what he was, even seeing the damage he caused, she couldn't help but crave his affection. It's a reminder that monsters don't just destroy their enemies, they poison everything they touch, including those who love them. The financial aftermath of Saffron's death revealed the true extent of his empire. Forensic accountants spent years trying to untangle the web of companies, trusts, and offshore accounts he had created. They found property holdings across Australia worth tens of millions, bank accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, investments in legitimate businesses that had no idea their silent partner was a crime boss. But they also found something else, evidence of crimes that had never been investigated. Fire insurance claims that coincided with development applications being rejected. Property transfers that happened just before owners disappeared. Payment records that matched the dates of unsolved murders. It was a roadmap of criminality stretching back decades, but with the perpetrator dead, there was no one to prosecute. One of the most heartbreaking discoveries was a safe deposit box containing what investigators called the insurance files. These were documents and photographs that Saffron had collected on hundreds of prominent Australians, politicians, judges, business leaders, celebrities. Even after his death, these files explained why so many people had protected him. He had turned Sydney's elite into unwitting co-conspirators, each protecting Saffron to protect themselves. The families of Saffron's victims faced a particular kind of torment. For decades, they had been told their loved ones' deaths were accidents, suicides, or simply unsolved mysteries. Now evidence was emerging that suggested murder, but with Saffron dead, and most of his associates either dead or unwilling to testify, they would never see justice. The families of the Luna Park victims were especially vocal. They had always suspected the fire was deliberately lit, but had been dismissed as conspiracy theorists, grief-stricken parents unable to accept that sometimes terrible accidents just happen. The 2021 documentary vindicated them, but it was a hollow victory. Their children were still dead, the man responsible had died peacefully in his sleep, and the system that had protected him offered no apologies, no accountability, no justice. One mother who lost her 13-year-old son in the fire told reporters that she had spent 40 years wondering if she was crazy, if her suspicions were just a manifestation of grief. Learning the truth that her son had been murdered for a real estate deal didn't bring peace. It brought rage. Rage at Saffron, but even more at the police who covered it up, the politicians who looked away, the entire city that had let this happen. The impact of Saffron's crimes rippled through generations. Children who grew up in King's Cross during his reign describe a neighborhood where violence was normalized, where corruption was assumed, where young girls were seen as commodities and young boys as future foot soldiers. Many struggled with addiction, trauma, and cycles of violence that traced directly back to the culture Saffron had created. Social workers in the area talk about Saffron syndrome, a cluster of behaviors and attitudes that persist in the community even today. A deep distrust of authority, an assumption that everyone is corrupt, a fatalistic acceptance that the powerful will always exploit the powerless. It's a psychological scar on an entire community, a wound that hasn't healed even decades after the infection was removed. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Saffron's legacy is how he changed Australia's understanding of itself. Australia had always prided itself on being different from America or Europe, less violent, less corrupt, more egalitarian. The fair go was supposedly a national value, the idea that everyone deserved an equal chance. Saffron exposed this as a myth. He showed that Australia could be just as corrupt, just as cruel, just as willing to sacrifice the vulnerable for the profit of the powerful. The investigations that followed Saffron's death revealed corruption networks that extended far beyond Sydney. Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, every major Australian city had its own version of the Saffron system. He hadn't just been a crime boss, he had been a pioneer, showing others how to turn crime into an industry and corruption into an institution. In 2017, more than a decade after Saffron's death, a retired judge who asked not to be named gave an interview that sent shockwaves through the legal community. He admitted that he had taken bribes from Saffron in the 1970s and 80s, that he had dismissed cases against Saffron's associates, that he had perverted justice for money. He was dying of cancer and wanted to clear his conscience. This judge estimated that at least a dozen of his colleagues had also been on Saffron's payroll. Think about that. The highest level of the justice system, the last resort for victims seeking fairness, had been corrupted. How many innocent people went to jail because they had crossed Saffron? How many guilty people walked free because they worked for him? We'll never know the full extent of the miscarriages of justice. As I dove deeper into this story, I found myself wondering about the people who stood up to Saffron and survived. They were few, but they existed. Journalists who kept writing despite threats, police officers who refused bribes despite the career consequences, politicians who spoke out despite the personal cost. These people are the forgotten heroes of this story, the proof that even in the darkest corruption, integrity can survive. One such hero was Shirley Briffman, a former madam who in 1971 decided to testify about police corruption linked to Saffron's empire. She was placed in protective custody, but it wasn't enough. She was found dead in her police-protected apartment in 1972, officially from a drug overdose. Her family maintains she was murdered. The message to other potential witnesses was clear. Even police protection couldn't protect you from Saffron. Another was Christopher Dale Flannery, known as Mr. Rent-A-Kill, who allegedly carried out hits for Saffron before disappearing in 1985. Before his disappearance, he had reportedly been talking to crime reporters, possibly about turning witness. His body was never found. Even among criminals, crossing Saffron was a death sentence. But the true heroes might be the ordinary people who simply refused to participate, the police officers who quit rather than take bribes, the politicians who chose different careers rather than enter Saffron's web, the journalists who wrote about flower shows and local sports rather than risk writing about organized crime. They don't get monuments or medals, but they kept their integrity in a time when integrity could cost you everything. As we near the end of this story, I want to talk about memory and justice. Saffron is dead, most of his associates are dead, many of his victims are dead. The Sydney that allowed him to flourish has changed, gentrified, sanitized. It would be easy to forget, to let this story fade into history, to move on, but forgetting would be the final victory for Abe Saffron. He spent his life trying to rewrite history, to turn himself from criminal to businessman, from monster to misunderstood entrepreneur. Remembering what he really was, what he really did, is the only justice his victims will ever receive. There's a plaque now at Luna Park, listing the names of those who died in the ghost train fire. 7 names. 4 children who should have grown up, gone to university, had careers and families. a father and his two young sons who went for a day of fun and never came home. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, families gather to remember. It's not enough, but it's something. Juanita Nielsen has no grave, no memorial, no marker except in the memories of those who knew her and the archives of the newspapers that still occasionally run stories about her disappearance. She has become a symbol of everyone who challenged power and paid the ultimate price. Her case remains officially unsolved, but everyone knows who was responsible. The sex workers, the gambling addicts, the small business owners extorted into bankruptcy, they have no memorials at all. They suffered and died in anonymity, statistics in Saffron's profit margins. Their stories are mostly lost, told only in fragments by aging social workers and retired cops who remember but can't prove. And what of Sydney itself? King's Cross has been transformed. The old strip clubs are gone, replaced by trendy restaurants. The brothels have become boutique hotels. The mean streets where Saffron's enforcers once walked are now filled with young professionals walking their dogs. It's as if the city has tried to erase its shameful past through urban renewal, but cities like people carry their scars. In the bureaucratic procedures designed to prevent corruption, in the elaborate oversight mechanisms that slow down development, in the deep cynicism that Sydneysiders still express about their politicians and police, you can see Saffron's shadow. He taught the city that everyone is potentially corrupt, and the city learned that lesson too well. There's a phrase in criminal justice: justice delayed is justice denied. By that measure, Abe Saffron was never brought to justice. He lived a long life, died a natural death, and left a fortune to his heirs. His victims received no compensation. His crimes went largely unpunished. The system he corrupted protected him to the end. But there's another kind of justice, slower and less satisfying, but perhaps more lasting. It's the justice of truth finally being told, of stories finally being heard, of the corrupt being exposed even if they can't be prosecuted. It's the justice of a new generation learning from the mistakes of the old, of systems being reformed, of cultures slowly, painfully changing. Today, Sydney has anti-corruption commissions, integrity units, independent oversight bodies. None of these existed in Saffron's heyday. They exist because of him, because the horror of what he was allowed to do finally became impossible to ignore. In a perverse way, Saffron's greatest contribution to Australian society might be the reforms that his crimes eventually forced. But here's what haunts me, what should haunt all of us. Everything that allowed Saffron to flourish: greed, ambition, the desire for forbidden pleasures, the willingness to look away from evil if it doesn't directly affect us, all of that still exists. Human nature hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed is the systems we've built to contain it, and systems can be corrupted again. Right now, somewhere in Australia, there's probably a young criminal watching, learning, planning. They've studied Saffron's mistakes. They know to be more careful with evidence, to use encrypted communications, to launder money through cryptocurrencies. They know to be less flamboyant, to avoid the spotlight that eventually contributed to Saffron's downfall. They're out there, and the question is whether we'll stop them or whether, like Saffron, they'll operate for decades before anyone acts. I want to end this story with something Alan Saffron told me that I can't forget. He said that near the end of his father's life, when Abe Saffron was dying of cancer, he had a moment of what seemed like vulnerability. He asked his son if he thought God would forgive him. Alan asked him if he was sorry for what he'd done. Saffron thought for a long moment and then said, "I'm sorry I got caught." That was Abe Saffron: no redemption, no repentance, no recognition of the suffering he had caused. To the very end, his only regret was that he hadn't been clever enough to avoid that one tax conviction. The thousands of lives he destroyed, the institutions he corrupted, the city he poisoned, none of that troubled his conscience because he didn't have one. But here's the twist that changes everything, the detail that shows the true horror of the Saffron story. In 2019, 13 years after Saffron's death, investigators uncovered a storage unit in Sarai Hills that had been paid for in advance for 20 years. Inside, they found filing cabinets full of documents, photographs, and audio recordings. It was Saffron's real archive, the one he had hidden even from his lawyers. Among these files was a cassette tape labeled Insurance 1979. When investigators played it, they heard Saffron's voice, calm and businesslike, discussing the Luna Park fire. But he wasn't planning it, he was discussing it the day after it happened. The recording made it clear that while Saffron had wanted to acquire Luna Park, the fire had been an accident, started by local teenagers playing with matches, just as one early witness had claimed before being pressured to recant. But here's what Saffron did that was even worse than murder. He used the accidental fire to his advantage. He had his corrupt police contacts steer the investigation away from the real culprits and toward an electrical fault conclusion. He spread rumors that he had ordered the fire, building his reputation for ruthlessness. He let grieving families believe their children had been murdered for profit when they had actually died in a preventable accident that proper safety measures could have avoided. He had weaponized a tragedy, turned 7 accidental deaths into a legend that enhanced his power. He let the families suffer for decades believing their children were murdered, when the truth was both simpler and more horrible. Their children had died because of negligence, and a monster had used their deaths for his own gain. This wasn't revealed until 2019, 13 years after Saffron's death, 40 years after the fire. The families who had spent decades fighting for justice discovered that they had been fighting for the wrong thing. Their children hadn't been murdered, they had been used after death as pawns in Saffron's game of power. One mother, upon learning this truth, said something that broke my heart. She said, "For 40 years I hated him for killing my boy. Now I hate him for making me waste 40 years hating him for the wrong reason. He stole my son's death just like he would have stolen his life." This is the ultimate tragedy of Abe Saffron. He didn't just commit crimes. He corrupted truth itself. He made it impossible to know what was real and what was performance, what was crime and what was accident, what was evil and what was merely negligence dressed up as evil for profit. He turned Sydney into a city where nothing could be trusted, where every tragedy might be a crime and every crime might be a lie. The storage unit contained more revelations. Documents showing that many of the murders attributed to Saffron were actually committed by rivals who knew the deaths would be blamed on him. Records indicating that some of the police he was thought to have corrupted had actually been taking money from his competitors to frame him. Evidence that the criminal empire everyone feared was partly real, partly myth, and partly the projection of a city's darkest fears. This doesn't absolve Saffron. He was still a monster who destroyed countless lives. But it shows that the true horror of systematic corruption isn't just what it does, it's what it makes impossible to know. When everyone is potentially corrupt, when nothing can be trusted, when crime and law enforcement become indistinguishable, then society itself breaks down. That was Saffron's real crime, not just breaking the law, but breaking the very concept of law. Today, as I walk through King's Cross, I think about all the people who walked these streets when they belonged to Abe Saffron. The victims and the victimizers, the corrupt and the incorruptible, the ones who fought and the ones who surrendered. They're mostly gone now, replaced by a new generation that knows Saffron only as a name in true crime documentaries. But their ghosts remain and their stories matter, because the moment we forget what happened here, the moment we stop remembering the price of looking away, that's the moment another Abe Saffron becomes possible. The final truth about Abe Saffron is this: he won. He lived a full life, he died peacefully, he never faced real justice, his victims never received real compensation. The system that protected him was eventually reformed, but too late for those he destroyed. He proved that in Australia, in the 20th century, with enough money and enough ruthlessness, you could get away with anything. That's not a comfortable truth, it's not a satisfying ending, but it's real, and sometimes the real horror is that there is no justice, no redemption, no final accounting. Sometimes the bad guys win and the good guys lose, and all we can do is remember and try to do better. Abe Saffron died at St. Vincent's Hospital on September 15, 2006. His last words, according to a nurse who was present, were, "I want more time." Even at the end, he was trying to negotiate, to make a deal, to buy what couldn't be bought. Death, unlike judges and politicians and police, couldn't be corrupted. But his legacy lives on in every corrupt official who thinks they won't get caught, in every criminal who believes they're untouchable, in every citizen who looks away from injustice because it's easier than fighting it. Saffron is dead, but what he represented, the corruption of power, the power of corruption, remains. The question now is what we do with this knowledge. Do we let it make us cynical, assuming everyone is corrupt because Saffron showed that anyone could be? Or do we let it make us vigilant, knowing that the price of justice is eternal watchfulness against those who would corrupt it? I choose vigilance. I choose to believe that while Saffron won his game, he didn't win forever. Every corrupt cop who goes to jail, every politician who gets exposed, every criminal who faces justice is a small victory against his legacy. Every institution that resists corruption, every individual who refuses to be bought, Every journalist who tells the truth despite threats is proof that Saffron's world doesn't have to be our world. The 7 who died at Luna Park: Richard Carroll, Michael Johnson, Jonathan Billings, Seamus Rahilly, John Godson, Damien Godson, and Craig Godson. They deserve to be remembered not as victims of Abe Saffron, but as victims of a society that allowed Abe Saffron to exist. Their deaths weren't just a tragedy, they were an indictment of everyone who knew what Saffron was and did nothing. Juanita Nielsen deserves to be remembered not just as someone who disappeared, but as someone who stood up to power knowing the risks. She died for her principles, which is more than Abe Saffron ever lived for. The unnamed victims, the trafficked women, the addicted gamblers, the extorted business owners, they deserve to be remembered too, even if we don't know their names. They were people with hopes and dreams and families, reduced to entries in Saffron's ledgers. And Sydney itself deserves to be remembered as it was, not the sanitized version of today, but the compromised, corrupted city that let a monster rule its streets for half a century. Not to shame it, but to remind it that vigilance is the price of virtue. As I finish this story, I think about what Abe Saffron would make of it. He'd probably sue me if he were alive. He'd claim defamation, demand retractions, try to bury the truth under legal threats. But he's dead, and the dead can't sue. The truth can finally be told without fear, which is perhaps the only real justice his victims will ever receive. The story of Abe Saffron is over, but the questions it raises remain. How do we prevent the rise of another Saffron? How do we build institutions that can't be corrupted? How do we create a society where crime doesn't pay and corruption doesn't prosper? These aren't easy questions and the answers aren't simple, but maybe that's the point. Maybe the lesson of Abe Saffron is that there are no easy answers, no simple solutions, no final victories against corruption. There's only the daily choice to resist it, the constant vigilance against those who would corrupt our institutions, and the courage to speak truth even when power wants silence. That's not a hopeful ending, but it's an honest one. And after decades of lies, after years of cover-ups, after a lifetime of deception, perhaps honesty is the only tribute we can offer to Saffron's victims. They deserved better than they got. They deserved justice that never came. The least we can do is tell their truth and remember their suffering. Abe Saffron is dead, his empire is dissolved, his fortune is dispersed. But in the end, his greatest crime wasn't what he did, it was what he made us become. He turned us into a society of cynics who assume everyone is corrupt, who expect nothing from our institutions, who look away from crime because we believe nothing can be done. That's his true legacy, and it's one we're still living with. Every time we assume a politician is corrupt without evidence, every time we believe the system is rigged without trying to fix it, every time we look away from injustice because we think it's inevitable, we're living in Abe Saffron's world. The only way to truly defeat Abe Saffron is to reject that world, to believe that justice is possible even when it seems impossible, to fight corruption even when it seems omnipresent, to tell the truth even when lies would be easier, to remember the victims even when forgetting would be more comfortable. That's how we honor the 7 who died at Luna Park. That's how we remember Juanita Nielsen. That's how we acknowledge all the unnamed victims of Saffron's empire, not with monuments or memorials, but with the daily decision to be better than the society that let him flourish. Abe Saffron wanted to be remembered as a successful businessman, a pioneer of Australian entertainment, a victim of jealous prosecutors and lying journalists. Instead, he'll be remembered as he truly was, a cautionary tale about what happens when crime pays, when corruption spreads, when good people do nothing. And perhaps that's the final irony. Saffron spent his life trying to control his story, to write his own legend, to force the world to see him as he wanted to be seen, but in the end, the truth won. Not in time to save his victims, not in time to see him punished, but eventually, inevitably, the truth won. That's the only comfort I can offer as we end this dark journey through Australian crime history. The truth may come slowly, justice may fail, the powerful may escape consequences, but eventually, somehow, the truth emerges. And once it does, no amount of money, no level of corruption, no degree of power can bury it again. Abe Saffron is dead, his victims are mostly dead, the Sydney he ruled is gone, but the truth lives on, and as long as it does, there's hope that the next Abe Saffron will be stopped before he can build his empire, before he can corrupt the system, before he can destroy so many lives. That's not much of a hope, but it's all we have, and sometimes, in the face of such darkness, even the smallest light is worth protecting.